Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into a question that has followed humanity for as long as we have been able to remember, the idea of time travel and the strange individuals who claim they have already experienced it. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable, and when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always such a gentle joy to see all the places we gather from, each in our own small moment in time. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft, steady hum, and let's begin. And if your mind starts to drift, that's perfectly all right. You don't have to hold on to every thought. Just let it pass, like time itself. Imagine, for a moment, a simple clock, not a digital one, glowing quietly in the corner of a room, but an old-fashioned clock, the kind with hands that sweep slowly across its face. You can almost hear it ticking, a soft, steady rhythm. Tick, and then another. Tick. It feels reliable, predictable, each second arriving just as the last one leaves. But what if that rhythm wasn't as steady as it seems? What if time, instead of flowing like a straight, endless river, could bend, stretch, or even fold in ways we don't quite notice? It's a strange thought, isn't it? Because most of us move through time without ever questioning it. Morning becomes afternoon. Afternoon fades into evening. Days stack into weeks, and weeks into years. And somewhere along the way, we begin to feel that time is something fixed, something solid, something that carries us forward whether we like it or not. And yet, scattered across history, there are stories. Quiet, persistent stories. Stories of people who claim they didn't just move through time, but stepped outside of it. Some say they have seen cities that do not yet exist. Others describe moments where the world around them seemed to shift, as though they had wandered into a different year without warning. And a few, just a few, speak with such certainty that it becomes difficult to dismiss them entirely. These individuals are sometimes called chrononauts, time travelers, but not the kind you might imagine from films or novels, not people surrounded by glowing machines or dramatic flashes of light. No, these are often ordinary individuals, people who are walking down a street, or taking a photograph, or simply living an ordinary day, when something quietly unusual happened, something that didn't quite fit. And perhaps the most curious part is this. They often don't appear extraordinary at first. They look like anyone else. They speak like anyone else. But then there is always a small detail, a piece that doesn't belong, a thread that seems to have come loose from the fabric of time, a document from a place that doesn't exist, a photograph of something that hasn't happened yet, or sometimes nothing more than a story, calmly told, steady, unwavering. And as you listen, you might find yourself wondering, not whether it's true, but whether it could be, because that's where the real mystery begins, not in proving or disproving these stories, but in the quiet space between them, the space where certainty fades just a little and curiosity takes its place. Of course, there are explanations. There are always explanations. Some stories unravel under closer inspection, others turn out to be misunderstandings or clever fabrications, or the mind filling in gaps in ways that feel real even when they're not. Human memory, after all, is not a perfect recording. It's more like a story we tell ourselves, one that changes ever so slightly each time we remember it. And yet, even when we account for all of that, even when we set aside the obvious hoaxes and the easily explained illusions, something remains. A small collection of stories that feel just a little too consistent. People appearing in places they shouldn't be. Moments that seem to slip, just briefly, out of alignment. And perhaps most intriguingly, individuals who appear and then disappear, without leaving a clear explanation behind. It's almost as if time, instead of being a straight line, is something softer, something that can ripple, like the surface of a calm lake, disturbed by a stone you didn't see being thrown. You might not notice it at first, just a slight distortion, a gentle wave moving outward. But if you look closely, you begin to see that the surface was never as still as it seemed. And so tonight, we're not here to prove that time travel is real. We're not here to convince you that it isn't either. Instead, we're going to do something quieter. We're going to listen to these stories, gently, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. We'll explore what people claim to have seen, what science quietly allows, and what the human mind is capable of believing. And somewhere along the way, you may begin to notice something unexpected, that the question isn't just whether someone can travel through time, but whether time itself is as simple as we've always imagined. And as that thought settles in, like a soft echo in the background of your mind, we can begin to look a little closer at those first moments when someone appears and something feels just slightly out of place. There is a certain feeling, one that is difficult to describe but instantly recognizable when it happens. It's the feeling that something is not quite right, not dramatically wrong, not something that demands immediate attention, but something quieter, subtler, like a note in a familiar song that is just slightly off, almost blending in, but not entirely. You might have felt it before, perhaps while walking through a place you know well, only to suddenly feel as though it has changed in some small, unexplainable way, or when meeting someone who seems perfectly ordinary. And yet there is a detail that doesn't quite fit, a pause that lingers a little too long, a sentence that feels slightly out of time. Now imagine that feeling, but magnified, because many of the stories surrounding so-called time travelers do not begin with anything dramatic at all. There are no glowing portals, no sudden flashes of light, no machines humming with impossible energy. Instead, they begin quietly, with a person who appears and simply does not belong. Sometimes it's their clothing. A man walking through a busy street dressed in a style that seems decades out of place. Not like someone wearing vintage, fashion for fun, but as if they genuinely believe they're dressed normally. Their movements are natural, their expressions calm. And yet, when you look closer, something doesn't align. Other times, it's the objects they carry. A camera that belongs to another era, a document that refers to a place no one recognizes, a map that seems familiar, until you realize that one of the countries on it doesn't exist. And then there are the smaller details, the ones that are easy to overlook but difficult to explain once noticed. A person asking for directions to a building that has been gone for years, someone speaking confidently about events that haven't happened yet, or remembering places in a way that no longer matches reality. At first, these moments might seem easy to dismiss, a misunderstanding perhaps, a simple mistake. After all, people get confused, memory is imperfect, and the world itself is constantly changing. But what makes these stories linger is not the strangeness itself, it's the consistency. Across different times, different places, and different cultures, the pattern repeats. Someone appears, they seem disoriented but not entirely lost. They know who they are, they speak clearly, and often they carry something, some small piece of their story that suggests they come from somewhere else, or perhaps someone else. And what's most interesting is that these individuals rarely behave like performers. They don't try to convince large crowds. They don't seek attention in obvious ways. In many cases, they seem confused by the attention they receive, as though they themselves are trying to understand what has happened. It creates a quiet tension, because if someone is clearly pretending, it becomes easier to dismiss. But when someone appears sincere, when their confusion feels genuine, the story becomes harder to let go of. Of course, sincerity does not equal truth. A person can believe something completely and still be mistaken. The mind is capable of constructing experiences that feel deeply real, even when they are not rooted in external reality. Memories can shift, perceptions can blur, and sometimes the line between imagination and experience becomes difficult to see. But even with that understanding, something about these stories remains. Perhaps it's the way they begin. Always in the middle of ordinary life, a street, a train station, a quiet town, a place where nothing unusual is expected to happen. And then, without warning, something small changes. Not enough to disrupt everything, but enough to create a question. And questions have a way of lingering, especially when they don't have clear answers. If you were to collect these accounts, place them side by side gently without forcing them into conclusions, you might begin to notice something else, a feeling that runs through all of them. Not fear, exactly, not excitement either, but something softer, a kind of quiet disorientation, as though the person at the centre of the story has stepped slightly out of sync with the world around them. Not entirely removed, just shifted. Like two clocks that were once perfectly aligned, now drifting apart by a few seconds. And at first that difference is barely noticeable, but over time it grows, until eventually the gap becomes impossible to ignore. And yet the world continues as if nothing has changed. People walk past, conversations continue, life moves forward, and only a few notice that something, or someone, doesn't quite fit into the rhythm anymore. It raises a gentle but persistent question. If time is something we all share, why would it ever allow someone to fall out of step? Is it a mistake, a misunderstanding, a trick of perception, or could it be something else entirely? Something that suggests time is not as rigid as we assume? Because if time were perfectly fixed, perfectly synchronized, then every moment would align seamlessly. Every person would move forward together, like dancers following the same quiet rhythm. But these stories suggest otherwise. They hint at the possibility that time might behave more like overlapping melodies, occasionally slipping, occasionally drifting, occasionally allowing a note from one moment to echo into another. Not often, not in ways we can easily measure, but just enough to be noticed. And as that idea begins to settle, gently, in the background of your thoughts, it invites us to look a little closer. Not just at the people who appear out of place, but at what happens next. Because if appearing is strange, what follows is often even stranger. If the first part of these stories feels unusual, the next part feels almost impossible to hold on to, because again and again, across many different accounts, something quietly repeats. The person appears, they speak, they move, they leave behind questions, and then they are gone. Not in a dramatic way, not with a clear ending, but in a way that feels unfinished, like a sentence that was never completed. It's this pattern, the appearance followed by disappearance, that gives these stories their lingering weight. Because a mystery at least can be investigated, but something that vanishes leaves very little behind. Imagine, for a moment, checking into a small hotel, nothing luxurious, just a quiet place along a road, perhaps on a long journey. The building looks slightly old-fashioned but comfortable enough. The rooms are simple. The furniture feels like it belongs to another time, but not in a way that seems alarming. You sleep, you wake, you leave. And then, days later, you return, only to find that the hotel is no longer there, not closed, not abandoned, gone, no building, no sign, no record that it ever existed. At first it sounds like a misunderstanding. Perhaps the location was mistaken. Perhaps memory has blurred the details. But in some of these accounts, the people involved are certain. They remember the layout, the rooms, even the smallest details, the texture of the sheets, the sound of footsteps in the hallway. And yet, there is nothing left to confirm it, just memory and the quiet discomfort that comes with it. In other cases, the disappearance is even more immediate. A person is placed in a room, observed, surrounded by others. There are doors, walls, windows, boundaries that should make escape impossible. Everything feels contained, controlled, and then, at some point, they're simply no longer there. No sound, no struggle, no trace. It's the kind of detail that doesn't shout for attention, but once you notice it, it's difficult to ignore. Because it doesn't behave like a normal event. It behaves like something that has slipped through a gap. And that idea of a gap is where these stories begin to shift from strange to quietly unsettling. Because what kind of world allows for something like that? If time is a continuous flow, like a river moving steadily forward, then everything within it should move along together. People, places, events, all carried by the same current. But what if, just occasionally, the current isn't perfectly smooth? What if there are small disturbances, gentle eddies in the flow, places where the water loops back on itself, or folds inward in ways we can't easily see? In such a place, something might drift away from the main current. Not forever, not dramatically, just enough to become unanchored. And if that were to happen, how would it look from the outside? Perhaps like a person who appears suddenly, as though they've stepped into the river from somewhere else, and then, just as quietly, steps out again. The idea is difficult to grasp, and it should be, because it challenges something we rely on without thinking, the stability of time itself. We trust that time moves forward, that it holds everything in place, that it does not lose things or return them without explanation. And yet these stories suggest something softer, something less rigid. They suggest that time might not be a perfectly sealed path, but something more like overlapping layers, thin, delicate layers that occasionally brush against one another. And when they do, something slips through. Of course, there are other explanations. There always are. Memory can be unreliable. Details can shift over time. Stories can grow, slowly, as they are retold. A missing building might have been demolished. A person who vanished might have found a way out that no one noticed. And sometimes, the simplest explanation is the correct one. But what makes these accounts linger is not just the event itself, it's the pattern, the repetition, different people, different places, different decades, and yet the same quiet sequence unfolds: appearance, confusion, and then absence. It's almost as if the story is incomplete by design, as though we are only ever given the beginning and never the end. And perhaps that is why these stories feel so difficult to dismiss entirely, because they don't resolve, they don't conclude neatly, they remain open, like a door that was never fully closed. And as you sit with that thought, you might begin to notice something else, that the disappearance in many ways is more powerful than the appearance, because an appearance raises a question, but a disappearance removes the possibility of an answer, And without answers, the mind begins to wander. It tries to fill the space, to imagine what might have happened, to connect pieces that don't quite fit together, and in doing so, it becomes part of the story itself. So perhaps the mystery is not just about those who appear and vanish. Perhaps it's also about us, about the way we respond to uncertainty, the way we search for meaning in incomplete patterns, the way we hold on to questions even when no clear answer arrives. Because time, as we experience it, feels steady. But these stories, quiet, scattered, unresolved, suggest that there may be moments when that steadiness falters just slightly. Not enough to disrupt everything, but enough to leave an impression. And as that impression lingers, soft and unfinished, it invites us to look more closely at the stories themselves, not just how they begin or how they end, but what they contain, the details, the claims, the fragments of evidence that seem, at first glance, to support something extraordinary. Because once we begin to examine those details, gently, carefully, another layer of the mystery begins to unfold. There is something about a single, well-told story that can feel more powerful than 100 scattered ones. Perhaps because it gives the mind something to hold on to, a shape, a sequence, a beginning, a middle, and what feels like an ending, even if that ending remains unresolved. One such story begins in a place that, on the surface, feels entirely ordinary. An airport, a space filled with movement, people arriving and departing, carrying luggage, checking documents, passing through gates. A place where identities are verified, where locations are confirmed, where everything is meant to be precise. And yet, it is here, of all places, that one of the most unusual accounts of a so-called time traveller quietly unfolds. The story tells of a man who arrived on a routine international flight. Nothing about him seemed particularly remarkable at first glance. He was described as calm, well-dressed, and cooperative. He spoke multiple languages. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to travel. But when officials examined his passport, something didn't align. The document appeared authentic. The paper, the stamps, the formatting, all seemed consistent with official records, and yet the country listed on the passport did not exist. The man insisted he was from a place called Taured. He spoke of it as though it were completely normal, as though everyone should recognize it. When shown a map, he pointed to a region in Europe and expressed confusion, because where others saw one country, he saw another. Taured, he explained, had existed for over 1,000 years. To him, there was no contradiction, but to the officials around him, there was no such place. At this point, the situation begins to shift. What started as a routine check becomes something more uncertain. Questions are asked, documents are examined again. The man remains calm but grows increasingly confused. Not defensive, not evasive, just unsettled. As though the world around him has made a mistake. Eventually he is taken to a secure room, asked to wait while authorities investigate further. His documents are kept. His presence is noted. Everything proceeds in a controlled, methodical way. And then something happens that transforms the story from unusual to quietly unsettling. By the next morning, the man is gone. No signs of forced exit, no record of departure, no clear explanation, just absence. The room, once occupied, now empty. And with that, the story ends. Or rather, it stops. Because there is no resolution, no final answer, no confirmation of what truly happened. Only a collection of details and a lingering question. Was the man mistaken? Was the passport fabricated? Was the entire story constructed, perhaps unintentionally, through retelling and reinterpretation. These are reasonable possibilities. In fact, they are the most likely ones. Stories, especially those that pass through many hands and many voices, tend to evolve. Small details are added. Others are softened or removed. Over time, what began as a simple misunderstanding can take on the shape of something far more mysterious. And yet, even when we consider all of that, something about this story remains quietly compelling. Perhaps it is the setting, an airport, a place built on precision and verification, a place where identity is meant to be confirmed, not questioned. Or perhaps it is the man himself, because in many retellings, he is not described as deceptive or erratic. He does not appear to be inventing a story. He appears consistent, certain, as though his understanding of reality is stable, even if it does not match the world around him. And that introduces a different kind of possibility. Not that he came from another time, but that he experienced a different version of reality, a version where the details were slightly altered, where borders were drawn differently, where names, histories and places followed another path. It's a subtle shift, but an important one, because it moves the question away from physical time travel and towards something more abstract, the idea that reality itself may not be as singular as we assume. Of course, this does not make the story true, it simply changes the way we think about it, because whether the man existed or not, whether the events occurred exactly as described, the story introduces a pattern we've begun to see before. A person appears. They carry something that seems authentic, but does not align with our world. They behave as though nothing is unusual, and then they are gone. No explanation, no trace. And what remains is not proof, but tension. A quiet space between what we know and what we cannot fully explain. It's in that space that these stories continue to live, not because they are confirmed, but because they are unresolved. And perhaps that is why they are remembered, because certainty tends to fade quickly, but uncertainty lingers. It settles into the edges of our thoughts, returning occasionally, like a familiar tune you can't quite place, not demanding attention, but never fully disappearing either. And as we move forward gently into more of these accounts, it becomes clear that this is not the only story of its kind. There are others, some with more detail, some with what appears to be evidence, photographs, documents, objects that seem to bridge the gap between claim and reality. But as we will soon see, the presence of evidence does not always bring clarity. Sometimes it does the opposite. There is a quiet shift that happens when a story gains evidence. Up until now, many of these accounts have lived in the space of memory and description. Someone tells a story, others listen. The details are intriguing, sometimes unsettling, but ultimately intangible. You can imagine them, but you cannot hold them. But when a story comes with something more, something physical, something that can be examined, touched, or seen, it changes the way we respond. Because evidence feels different. It feels grounded, stable, real. And so, when one particular story began to circulate, it carried with it a sense of weight that others did not. It was the story of a young man who appeared in a modern city, carrying pieces of another time with him. He was found wandering through the streets, disoriented but calm. His clothing seemed outdated, his manner slightly out of step with the world around him. When approached, he spoke clearly but with a quiet confusion, as though the environment he had entered did not match his expectations. At first, this might have seemed like any other unusual encounter, but then the details began to accumulate. He carried identification documents from a country that no longer existed. The paper looked authentic, The markings were consistent with official records from decades earlier. His name matched historical data. The photograph aligned with his appearance, and perhaps most strikingly, he had a camera, an old one, the kind that uses film, physical strips that capture light and hold onto it until they are developed into images. A technology that, while not entirely obsolete, belongs more to the past than the present. Inside that camera, there were photographs, images that, at first glance, seemed ordinary, streets, buildings, familiar places. But when examined more closely, something became apparent. These photographs did not match the present. They showed the same city, but as it had looked many years ago. Different architecture, different vehicles, subtle differences in layout and design. Details that only become noticeable when compared side by side with the current world. It was as though the camera had captured a different version of the same place, a quieter, older version. And this is where the story begins to feel heavier. Because unlike memory, a photograph feels fixed. It feels like a direct imprint of reality, light captured and preserved, a moment held still. And so, when people hear about such images, the instinct is to trust them, to believe that what is seen must have existed. But even here, things are not as simple as they seem, because evidence, while powerful, is not immune to interpretation. A photograph can be genuine and still misunderstood. An object can be real and still tell a story that is not entirely accurate. In this particular case, as the story spread and more attention was given to the details, something began to shift. Investigations were conducted, backgrounds were examined, the origins of the images were traced, and slowly, quietly, another explanation emerged. The story, it turned out, was not a first-hand account of a real event. It was part of a television production, a dramatization, a carefully constructed narrative designed to explore the idea of time travel, blending elements of fiction with details that felt convincingly real. The photographs had been created, the documents designed, the entire sequence built to feel authentic, to draw the viewer in, to make the story linger. And in many ways, it succeeded. Because even after learning this, many people still remember the story not as fiction, but as possibility. And that reveals something important, something subtle but powerful. That evidence, especially when it aligns with what we want to believe, can feel more convincing than the truth itself. It's not because people are careless, it's because the mind is naturally drawn to coherence, to patterns, to stories that feel complete. When a narrative includes physical details, documents, photographs, objects, it creates a sense of structure, a sense that everything fits together, and when something fits together, it feels right, even if it isn't. This doesn't mean that all evidence is unreliable, far from it, but it does suggest that evidence alone is not enough. It must be understood, placed in context, examined with care. Because without that context, even the most convincing piece of information can lead us in the wrong direction. In a way, it's similar to looking at a single puzzle piece. On its own, it may appear clear, defined, complete, but without the surrounding pieces, its meaning remains uncertain, and sometimes it can even belong to an entirely different puzzle. So when we encounter stories of time travelers who bring back objects, photographs, or documents, it's worth pausing, not to dismiss them immediately, but to consider them gently. To ask not only, is this real, but also, what might this represent? Because in many cases, the presence of evidence does not resolve the mystery. It deepens it. It adds layers. It creates new questions. How was it created? Why does it look so convincing? And perhaps most importantly, why do we feel inclined to believe it? As that thought settles, you might begin to notice a quiet shift in perspective, that the mystery is no longer just about whether someone travelled through time, but about how easily we can be guided, gently, almost effortlessly, toward believing that they did. And from here, another kind of story begins to emerge, one not built on objects or photographs, but on something even more elusive: predictions, statements about the future, claims that reach forward in time rather than backward. Because while evidence can be examined, predictions can only be tested by time itself. There is a different kind of story, one that does not rely on photographs, documents, or objects. Instead, it rests on something far more intangible: knowledge. Not knowledge of the past, which can be checked and verified, but knowledge of the future. And among all the stories of supposed time travellers, these are perhaps the most intriguing, because they offer something that feels testable. If someone claims to have come from the future, then surely they should know what is coming next. And if what they say turns out to be true, then the story gains weight. But if it doesn't, well, then something else must explain it. One of the most well-known examples of this kind of story centres around a figure who appeared not in a busy street or a quiet town, but in the early days of the internet, a place where ideas travel quickly, where identities can be fluid, where stories can grow and spread without ever being fully anchored to a single source. This individual introduced himself calmly, without urgency, as someone from the future. A soldier, he said, from a time several decades ahead. He described his mission in simple terms. He had been sent back to retrieve a specific piece of technology, an older computer system, something that, in his time, was no longer available, but still necessary to solve a problem. At first, the story might have seemed like a piece of creative fiction, but then he began to answer questions. He described his world. He spoke of political tensions, of internal conflict, of a future that felt unstable, fragmented. He outlined a sequence of events that, according to him, would unfold over the coming years, and people listened, because there was something about the way he spoke that felt measured, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just detailed enough to seem thoughtful, just calm enough to feel believable. As time passed, the story spread. More people became aware of it. Some began to follow his predictions closely, waiting to see whether they would come true, because this was the test. If even a few of his claims aligned with reality, it would suggest something extraordinary. But as the years moved forward, something quieter happened. The predictions did not unfold as described. Events took different paths. Outcomes shifted. The future, as it often does, proved more complex and less predictable than any single narrative could capture. At this point, you might expect the story to fade, to be dismissed, set aside, forgotten, but that is not what happened. Instead, the explanation changed. According to this individual, the discrepancy was not a failure, it was a difference. He suggested that reality does not follow a single fixed timeline. Instead, it branches. Like the limbs of a tree, each choice, each event, each moment creating subtle divergences, new paths that move forward in slightly different directions. In his explanation, he had come from one such branch, and the world we were experiencing was another, similar but not identical, which meant that his predictions were not wrong. They were simply not meant for this version of reality. It's a fascinating idea, because it preserves the story, it protects it from contradiction, but it also introduces something important, a quiet shift in how the claim can be understood. Because once an explanation like this is introduced, something changes. The story can no longer be tested in the same way. If the predictions come true, it supports the claim. If they do not, it still supports the claim, because it can always be said that this is a different branch of events. In this way, the story becomes self-contained, not easily disproven, but also not easily confirmed. And this brings us to a gentle but important concept. A story that cannot be proven wrong also cannot be proven right. It exists in a kind of quiet balance, outside the usual ways we evaluate truth, and perhaps that is part of its appeal, because it allows the mind to wander, to imagine possibilities without needing to settle on a final answer, to hold on to the idea that somewhere, in some version of events, the story might be true. But it also reminds us of something else, that the future by its nature is uncertain, not because we lack information, but because it has not yet fully unfolded. It is shaped continuously by countless small actions, decisions, and moments that build upon one another in ways that are difficult to predict. Even with the most advanced tools, the most detailed models, the clearest understanding of patterns, there is always an element of unpredictability, a softness at the edges of what we know. And so when we encounter stories of individuals who claim to know the future, it may be helpful to approach them with a certain kind of calm curiosity. Not immediate belief, not immediate dismissal, but a willingness to listen, while also recognizing the limits of what can be verified. Because in the end, these stories do not just ask whether time travel is possible, they ask something quieter. How do we decide what to believe when certainty is out of reach? And as that question settles gently into place, it begins to open the door to another layer of this exploration. Because not all strange details come from grand predictions or elaborate stories. Sometimes they appear in something much simpler, a photograph, a small object, a fleeting image that seems just slightly out of place. And as we begin to look more closely at those moments, another pattern begins to reveal itself, one not about time itself, but about how we see. There is a particular kind of mystery that does not begin with a story. It begins with an image, a photograph perhaps, or a painting. Something still, something quiet, a frozen moment that seems, at first glance, entirely ordinary. And then you notice something, not immediately, not in a way that demands attention, but slowly, almost like your eyes adjusting in dim light, a detail begins to emerge. Something that doesn't quite belong. It might be a person in the background, dressed in a way that feels strangely modern for the time the image was taken, or an object held casually in someone's hand, an object that, to a contemporary eye, resembles something we recognize today, a small rectangular shape, held near the face, and suddenly the mind begins to fill in the gap. A phone. But that cannot be right, because the image was captured decades, sometimes even more than a century, before such devices existed, and yet the resemblance is difficult to ignore. These kinds of images have appeared again and again over the years. A figure in a crowd who seems out of place, a person wearing clothing that feels ahead of its time, a shape that resembles a piece of modern technology, quietly embedded in a moment from the past. At first, they can feel almost convincing, not as proof, but as suggestion, a gentle nudge toward a possibility, because the mind is remarkably good at recognizing patterns. In fact, it is always searching for them. From the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep, the brain is quietly organizing what we see, connecting shapes, identifying familiar forms, assigning meaning to what might otherwise be random. It's what allows us to recognize a face in a crowd, to read words on a page, to make sense of a complex world without needing to examine every detail individually. But that same ability can sometimes lead us in unexpected directions, because once the brain identifies a pattern, it tends to hold on to it. If something looks like a phone, we see a phone, even if the object is something else entirely. A small notebook, a compact mirror, a hearing device from an earlier era. The resemblance is enough, and once the idea is formed, it becomes difficult to unsee. It's a bit like looking at clouds. At first, they are just shapes, soft, shifting forms in the sky. But the moment someone says, "That one looks like a bird," something changes. Suddenly, the shape becomes clearer, the outline sharpens, and even though nothing about the cloud itself has changed, your perception of it has. You now see the bird, and it's difficult to go back to seeing just a cloud. The same process happens with these images. A suggestion is made, a comparison is drawn, and from that point on, the image carries a new meaning. But when examined more closely, many of these mysterious objects turn out to be far less extraordinary. A device that appears modern may have existed in an earlier form, serving a similar function. A piece of clothing that feels out of place may simply be an uncommon style that existed at the time. A person who seems different may just be someone whose appearance stands out against the expectations of the viewer. Because expectations play a powerful role. We don't just see what is in front of us, we see what we're prepared to recognize, and when something falls outside of that expectation, it can feel like it belongs to another time. This doesn't make the experience any less interesting. In fact, it may make it more so. Because it reveals something not about time travel, but about perception, about how the mind constructs reality from fragments, how it fills in gaps, how it creates continuity, even when the information is incomplete. And once you begin to notice this, the images take on a different quality. They are no longer clues pointing to something hidden in time. They become reflections of how we see, of how easily a small detail can shift the meaning of an entire scene, of how a single object, interpreted in a certain way, can transform an ordinary moment into something mysterious. And yet, even with this understanding, the images remain compelling, because they sit at the edge of certainty. They're not entirely explainable at first glance, and that small space between recognition and doubt is where curiosity lives. It's where the mind lingers, not rushing to conclude, but quietly exploring possibilities. What if it was something else? What if, just for a moment, the image captured something unexpected? Even if the explanation is simple, the question remains, and questions, as we've seen, have a way of staying with us. But as we continue to explore these stories, gently and without urgency, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because not all mysteries are visual, some are internal. They don't appear in photographs or documents, but in thoughts, memories, and experiences that feel deeply real, even when they may not reflect external events. And as we turn toward those inner landscapes, the quiet workings of the mind, we begin to encounter a different kind of time travel, one that doesn't require movement through space, only a shift in perception. There is a quiet assumption most of us carry, almost without noticing, that our memories are reliable, not perfect perhaps, not always complete, but still, in some way, anchored to reality. We tend to believe that what we remember, especially what we remember clearly, must have happened, more or less as we recall it. After all, memory feels solid. You can picture a moment from your past, a room, a conversation, the way the light fell across a table, or the sound of someone's voice. And in that moment, it doesn't feel like imagination. It feels like something you have returned to, something real, waiting for you. But memory is not quite like that. It is not a recording. It is something softer, something that is quietly rebuilt each time we revisit it, a bit like telling a story. The first time, the story's close to the original experience. But as it is told again and again, small details begin to shift. Certain elements become clearer, others fade. New pieces are added, sometimes without us realizing, and over time the story becomes something that feels complete, even if it has changed. This doesn't mean memory is unreliable in a careless way. It means it is creative. It fills in gaps. It smooths over uncertainty. It shapes itself into something that makes sense. And most of the time, this works beautifully. It allows us to navigate the world without constantly questioning everything we have experienced. But in certain situations, it can lead somewhere unexpected. There are cases of individuals who have described experiences of travelling through time, not as a distant possibility, but as something they personally remember, not imagined, remembered. They speak with clarity, with detail, with the kind of confidence that suggests they are not inventing a story, but recalling one. One such case involves a man who for many years lived an entirely ordinary life. There was nothing particularly unusual about his background, no early signs of strange experiences, no indication that he believed himself to be anything other than a typical person moving through time like everyone else. And then, something shifted. After watching a film, one that explored the idea of secret experiments and time travel, he began to feel a sense of familiarity, not just interest, recognition. The scenes, he said, felt like memories, not something he had seen before, but something he had lived through. At first, this might sound like a simple emotional response. Films often evoke strong feelings. They can feel immersive, even personal, but for him, it went further. Over time, he began to recall details, specific moments, locations, sequences of events that, in his mind, formed a continuous experience. He described being involved in experiments that moved individuals through time. He spoke of travelling to different periods, of witnessing events that others had not seen, and as he spoke, he did not hesitate. There was no sense of uncertainty in his voice, only conviction. From the outside, it might be tempting to dismiss such a story immediately, to assume fabrication. But that assumption misses something important, because in many of these cases the person is not trying to deceive. They are not constructing a story to convince others. They are describing what feels to them like a genuine memory. And that distinction matters, because it shifts the question from, is this person telling the truth, to something quieter. What does it mean for something to feel true? Memory, as we've seen, is not a fixed archive. It is a process. Each time we recall something, we're not retrieving a perfect copy. We're rebuilding it, using pieces of the original experience combined with our current understanding, our expectations, and sometimes external influences. A story we hear, a film we watch, an idea that resonates. These elements can become woven into memory, not as separate additions, but as part of the experience itself. And once they are integrated, they can feel indistinguishable from something that actually happened. It's a bit like dreaming. In a dream, events unfold with their own logic. You move through places, you speak with people, you experience moments that feel real, even while they are happening. And only later, when you wake, do you recognize the difference. But sometimes that boundary is not so clear, especially when the memory is revisited again and again, reinforced, shaped, until it settles into place. And once it settles, it becomes stable, consistent, convincing. This doesn't mean that all unusual memories are false. It simply means that the feeling of certainty is not always a reliable guide to reality, and that realization can feel slightly unsettling. because it suggests that even our most vivid experiences may not always reflect the external world as it truly is. But there is also something quietly reassuring in it, because it reminds us that the mind is not fragile, but adaptive. It builds meaning, it creates continuity, it allows us to move through time with a sense of identity, even as the details shift and evolve. And in that sense, memory is not just about the past. It is about how we understand ourselves, how we connect moments together, how we create a story that feels coherent even when the piece is not perfectly aligned. So when we encounter stories of individuals who claim to remember travelling through time, it may be helpful to listen with a certain kind of openness, not immediate belief, not immediate rejection, but curiosity. Because whether or not the events occurred as described, the experience itself is real. The feeling of having lived through something extraordinary is real. And understanding how that feeling arises brings us closer to something deeper, not about time travel, but about the mind. And as we begin to explore that inner landscape more gently, we may start to notice something else. That time itself, as we experience it, is not always steady. Sometimes it stretches, sometimes it compresses, sometimes it seems to move in ways that don't quite follow the quiet rhythm of a ticking clock. And it is in those moments that another kind of mystery begins to unfold. There is a quiet difference between time as it exists and time as it feels. Most of the time, we don't notice it. We move through our day, guided by clocks, schedules, and routines. Minutes pass, hours unfold, and everything seems to follow a steady, predictable rhythm. Morning becomes afternoon. Afternoon softens into evening, and time appears to flow forward, evenly, without interruption. But every now and then, something shifts, not in the world around us, but within us. And suddenly, time feels different. You might have noticed it in small moments, waiting for something, when each second seems to stretch, growing longer than it should. The ticking of a clock becomes more noticeable. The space between moments feels wider. Time slows, or at least it feels as though it does. And then, at other times, the opposite happens. You become absorbed in something, a conversation, a task, a quiet activity, and before you realize it, hours have passed. Time seems to collapse inward, folding gently, leaving only a faint sense of how much has gone by. The clock has not changed, but your experience of it has. This is one of the most familiar examples of how time can behave differently inside the mind, not because time itself has altered, but because our perception of it has. And in more unusual circumstances, this effect can become even more pronounced. There are moments, often during intense experiences, when time appears to slow dramatically. People describe situations where everything seems to unfold in careful detail. Movements become clearer, sounds more distinct. The sequence of events stretches, allowing each part to be noticed individually, as though the world has gently shifted into a slower rhythm. But when measured externally, the duration remains the same. Only the experience has changed. In other cases, time seems to fragment. Moments feel disconnected. Sequences blur. It becomes difficult to determine what happened first, or how long something lasted. The sense of continuity, the feeling that one moment leads smoothly into the next, begins to loosen. And then there are experiences that are even more unusual. Some individuals describe moments where time feels as though it is looping, not in a literal sense, but in a way that creates the impression of repetition, a conversation that feels familiar, as though it has already happened, a scene that seems to replay itself, not exactly the same, but close enough to create a quiet sense of déjà vu. You might recognize that feeling, walking into a room and sensing that you have been there before, even when you know you haven't, hearing a phrase that feels strangely familiar, experiencing a moment that seems to echo itself. These are subtle distortions. They don't last long, but they leave an impression, and in some cases these impressions become stronger. There are individuals who report experiences where the passage of time becomes deeply irregular, moments that seem to last far longer than they should, periods that feel compressed into something much shorter, or experiences where the usual sense of before and after becomes difficult to maintain. These experiences can be linked to many different factors: emotion, attention, fatigue, even the way the brain processes information under certain conditions. Because the mind does not measure time directly, it constructs it. It pieces together a sense of duration based on change, on the number of events, the intensity of experience, the focus of attention. When many things happen quickly, time feels full, and therefore longer. When fewer things happen, or when attention drifts, time feels lighter, and therefore shorter. It is not that time itself expands or contracts. It is that our experience of it becomes more or less dense, like a page filled with words compared to one that is nearly empty. Both pages occupy the same space, but one feels fuller, more substantial. And in a similar way, our perception of time is shaped by how much we experience within it. This helps explain something important: that time, as we feel it, is not a fixed stream, but something that adapts gently to our awareness. And once we begin to notice this, another possibility emerges: that some experiences of time travel may not involve movement through time at all, but movement within perception, a shift in how moments are processed, remembered, or connected. Because if the mind can stretch a second, or compress an hour, or create the feeling of repetition, then it is not difficult to imagine how, under certain conditions, it might also create the sense of having moved outside of time entirely, not physically, but experientially. This does not make such experiences any less meaningful. In fact, it may make them more so, because they reveal something about the nature of consciousness itself, that our experience of reality is not a direct reflection of the world, but a carefully constructed interpretation, a translation, one that usually aligns closely with external events, but not always perfectly. And when that alignment shifts, even slightly, the result can feel extraordinary. A moment that seems longer than it should, a sequence that feels out of order, a memory that appears more vivid, more complete than expected. And in those moments, the boundary between ordinary experience and something more unusual becomes softer, less defined. So when someone describes an experience that feels like stepping into another time, it may not always be necessary to imagine a journey through space or a break in the fabric of reality. Sometimes, it may be enough to consider how deeply the mind can shape the way time is felt, how it can bend the experience of a moment without changing the moment itself. And as that idea settles quietly, it leads us toward another question, not about how time behaves, but about why these ideas continue to capture us. Why, even with all these explanations, psychological, perceptual, and scientific, we still find ourselves drawn to the possibility that time could be more than what it seems, that somewhere, somehow, it might be possible to step beyond it. And as we begin to explore that feeling, that quiet desire, we move into something deeper, not about time itself, but about us. There is something quietly revealing about the kinds of stories we return to, across cultures, across centuries, across different forms of storytelling, whether spoken, written, or imagined. we see certain ideas appear again and again. Journeys to distant lands, encounters with the unknown, and perhaps most persistently of all, the idea of moving through time, not just observing it, but stepping outside of it. At first, it might seem like a simple curiosity, a fascination with possibility, a natural extension of imagination. After all, if we can travel across continents, if we can explore the depths of the ocean, if we can look out into the vastness of space, then it feels almost inevitable that we would wonder about time as well. But there is something deeper beneath that curiosity, something quieter, because time is not just another dimension we move through. It is something we live with, constantly. It shapes every experience, every decision, every memory, and unlike space, it moves in only one direction: forward. We cannot return to a moment once it has passed. We cannot pause it or step outside of it, or revisit it in the way we might revisit a place. And perhaps that is where the desire begins, in the awareness of what cannot be changed. There are moments we wish we could return to, things we would say differently, choices we might reconsider, opportunities we might approach with greater understanding, not necessarily to alter everything, but simply to see it again, to experience it once more with the knowledge we have now. And then there is the future, equally uncertain, equally unreachable. We move toward it, always, but we never quite arrive ahead of time. We cannot see it clearly. We cannot prepare for it completely. It unfolds gradually, revealing itself one moment at a time, and that uncertainty carries its own kind of weight. Questions about what lies ahead, about outcomes we cannot predict, about possibilities that remain just beyond our reach. Time, travel in this sense, becomes more than a scientific idea. It becomes a kind of answer, not a practical one, but an emotional one. A way of imagining that the limits we feel, those quiet boundaries of past and future, might not be absolute. That perhaps somewhere there is a way to step beyond them, even if only for a moment. This may help explain why stories of time travelers persist, even when they are difficult to verify, because they resonate, not just with curiosity, but with something more personal. They reflect a quiet hope that time is not entirely closed, that the past is not entirely lost, that the future is not entirely unknown, and that somehow we might have more access to it than we currently do. You can see this reflected in stories across history. Ancient texts describing individuals who journeyed through strange realms and returned to find that years had passed. Legends of travelers who stepped into hidden places only to emerge into a different time. Even modern narratives, films, books, conversations continue to explore these same ideas, often in different forms, but with the same underlying theme: a desire to move beyond the present moment, to explore what lies before and after, and perhaps to understand our place within it. Because time, for all its familiarity, remains deeply mysterious. We measure it. We organize our lives around it. We rely on it. But we do not fully understand it. Not in the way we understand objects or forces that can be observed directly. Time is something we experience, rather than something we can hold, and that makes it difficult to grasp, which may be why we turn to stories, because stories allow us to explore what cannot be directly experienced. They create space for possibilities. They offer a way to approach questions that do not yet have clear answers, and in doing so, they provide a kind of comfort, not by resolving uncertainty, but by giving it shape. So when someone claims to have travelled through time, the story does not exist in isolation. It connects to something already present within us, a curiosity, a longing, a quiet sense that there might be more to time than what we see on the surface. And even when we approach these claims with skepticism, even when we understand the psychological and perceptual explanations, that sense does not disappear. It remains, softly, in the background. Because it is not just about whether time travel is possible, it is about what the idea represents, a different relationship with time, one where moments are not entirely fixed, where the past is not entirely gone, where the future is not entirely hidden, and perhaps most importantly, where we are not entirely limited by the present. Of course, these are ideas, reflections, not conclusions, but they help explain why, even after examining the stories, questioning the evidence, and understanding the role of perception, we still return to the possibility, gently, curiously, not needing it to be true, but not entirely ready to let it go. And as we move forward, carrying that quiet sense of curiosity, we begin to shift again, from the inner world of memory and perception to something more external, more structured, because while the mind shapes how we experience time, there's also a question of how time behaves in the world itself, not as we feel it, but as it exists. And it is here, in the careful language of physics, that we begin to find something unexpected, not confirmation of the stories we've heard, but something just as intriguing. That time, even in the physical universe, may not be as simple as it appears. There is a quiet assumption we carry with us, almost every moment of our lives, that time moves the same for everyone, that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, the seconds pass at the same steady pace, that your experience of time, at least in its physical sense, is shared by everyone around you. It feels obvious. If you and someone else start a timer at the same moment, you expect it to remain in sync. If two clocks are set together, you assume they will continue to agree, and most of the time, they do, but not always. There is a subtle detail hidden beneath everyday experience that changes this picture in a way that feels almost unreal. Time can move at different speeds, not in the sense of feeling faster or slower like we explored before, but in a physical, measurable way. And the difference begins with something very simple. Motion. Imagine you're sitting quietly in a room. Nothing unusual. The air is still. The walls are steady. Time seems to move as it always does, one moment gently following the next. Now imagine someone else, not sitting, but moving. At first, the difference is small. They're walking, then running, then travelling in a vehicle, moving faster and faster. In everyday life, this difference doesn't seem to matter. Whether someone is walking or flying across the sky, we still feel as though we share the same flow of time. But when motion becomes extreme, something begins to shift. According to our best understanding of the universe, the faster something moves, the more slowly time passes for it. Not in a dramatic way at first. At everyday speeds, the difference is so small that it is almost impossible to notice. But it is there, quietly, consistently. And as speed increases, the effect becomes more pronounced. To understand this, it can help to imagine time not as something fixed, but as something that is connected to movement, like a rhythm, a steady beat that adjusts ever so slightly, depending on how you move through the world. At low speeds, the rhythm feels the same for everyone, but as you approach extremely high speeds, closer and closer to the fastest speed anything can travel, which is the speed at which light moves through empty space, that rhythm begins to stretch. Time slows down, not in your perception, but in the world itself. A simple way to imagine this is through a journey. Picture two individuals. One remains on Earth, living a quiet, ordinary life. The other boards a spacecraft and travels at an incredibly high speed, so fast that it approaches that universal speed limit, the speed of light. Inside the spacecraft, everything feels normal. The traveller breathes, thinks, observes. Their clock ticks steadily. 1 second follows another, just as it always has. But when they return to Earth, something unexpected happens. They find that more time has passed for those who stayed behind. What felt like a short journey to them has been a much longer span of time for others. It is as though they have stepped slightly into the future, not by intention, not by crossing a boundary, but simply by moving very, very fast. This idea is often illustrated through what is sometimes called a twin scenario. One twin stays on Earth, the other travels at high speed through space. When they reunite, the travelling twin is younger, not by perception, but by actual measurable time. Their clock has recorded fewer moments, and while this may sound like something from a story, it is not just theoretical. Experiments have been conducted using extremely precise clocks, devices so accurate that they can detect even the smallest differences in time. When one of these clocks is placed on an aircraft and flown around the world, and another is left on the ground, a difference appears. Small, but real. The clock that travelled falls slightly behind. Time passed a little more slowly for it. Even satellites orbiting Earth experience this effect. They move at high speeds, constantly circling the planet, and because of that motion, the passage of time for them is just slightly different from the passage of time on the surface below. The difference is tiny, but it matters. In fact, systems that rely on precise timing, like the ones that help determine location across the globe, must account for this difference. Otherwise, even small errors would begin to accumulate, and over time, those small errors would grow. So while we may not notice it in our daily lives, time is not perfectly uniform. It bends gently in response to motion. Not enough to disrupt our routines, not enough to change the rhythm of everyday life, but enough to remind us that time is not as rigid as it appears, and perhaps that is the most surprising part. That something so fundamental, something we rely on without question, can behave in ways that feel almost counterintuitive. The faster you move, the more slowly time passes, not as an illusion, but as a feature of the universe itself. And in that sense, time travel, at least in one direction, is not entirely out of reach. It is already happening, quietly, subtly, all around us. Every airplane, every satellite, every fast-moving object is experiencing time just a little differently. Not enough to notice, but enough to measure, enough to confirm. And as this idea begins to settle in gently, it opens the door to something deeper. Because if motion can change the way time flows, what about gravity? What about the presence of massive objects? Places where the pull is stronger, where space itself feels heavier? Could that too influence the passage of time? And as we begin to turn our attention toward that question, the picture of time becomes even more intriguing. There is something almost comforting about the idea that time flows evenly, that no matter where you are, whether standing on a quiet street, sitting by a window, or resting under a night sky, the passage of time feels the same, second by second, moment by moment, a steady rhythm. But as we've begun to see, that rhythm is not entirely fixed. Motion can stretch it, gently, subtly. And now, there is something else to consider, something even more familiar than motion: gravity, the quiet force that holds us to the ground, the reason objects fall, the reason planets orbit, the reason everything has a sense of weight. We don't usually think of gravity as something that affects time. It feels separate. One is about falling, about attraction, about movement towards something. The other is about duration, about change, about the unfolding of moments. But in the deeper structure of the universe, these two are not separate at all. They're connected. To understand this connection, it can help to imagine something soft, not a rigid structure, but something flexible, like a stretched fabric. Picture a large, smooth surface, something like a sheet pulled tight. If you place a small object on it, the surface bends just slightly, barely noticeable. But if you place something much heavier, the effect becomes clearer. The fabric curves inward, forming a gentle dip around the object. Now imagine that this surface is not just spaces, but space and time together, a single, unified structure. And when something with mass, something heavy, exists within it, that structure bends, not only in space, but in time as well. This bending is not something we can see directly, but we can observe its effects, because where gravity is stronger, time moves more slowly. Again, not in the way it feels, but in the way it actually passes. To explore this, imagine two identical clocks, precise, perfectly synchronized. One is placed at the top of a tall mountain. The other is placed deep down, closer to the center of the Earth. At first, you would expect them to remain in sync. After all, they are identical, but over time, a small difference appears. The clock closer to the stronger gravitational pull, deeper, nearer the Earth, ticks just a little more slowly. The difference is incredibly small, far too small to notice in daily life. But it is measurable, and it is consistent. Time in a stronger gravitational field slows down, not dramatically, not in a way that disrupts ordinary experience, but enough to reveal something profound. That time is not separate from the structure of the universe, it is part of it, and just like space can curve and bend, so can time. A helpful way to think about this is through a simple comparison. Imagine two paths. One is smooth and straight, the other curves gently downward. If you were to move along each path, the experience would feel slightly different. The curved path might take longer, or require more effort, even if the distance appears similar. In a similar way, when space and time are curved by gravity, the path that time follows is altered. It stretches, it slows, and once again, this is not just a theoretical idea. It has been tested, carefully, using clocks so precise that they can detect differences smaller than a fraction of a second. When placed at different heights, even within the same building, these clocks show slight variations in the passage of time. The higher one, where gravity is slightly weaker, ticks just a bit faster. The lower one, where gravity is stronger, ticks just a bit slower. It's a subtle effect, but it is real. And when extended to more extreme environments, places where gravity is much stronger, such as near massive celestial objects, the effect becomes more pronounced. Time slows more noticeably, moments stretch further, and in the most extreme cases, near objects so dense that their gravitational pull becomes overwhelming, time can slow dramatically compared to regions farther away. To an outside observer, it might appear as though time itself is nearly standing still, while for someone within that region, everything feels normal. Seconds pass, thoughts unfold, nothing feels different, and yet, compared to the outside world, less time has passed. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of time, that it is not absolute. It is not the same everywhere. It is shaped gently, continuously, by the environment in which it exists, by motion, by gravity, by the structure of space itself. And when we begin to understand this, even in a soft and intuitive way, it changes how we think about time. It is no longer just a steady flow, carrying everything forward. it becomes something more dynamic, something that can stretch, bend, and shift quietly without drawing attention to itself. And this leads to an interesting realization that the idea of moving into the future is not entirely beyond reach. We've already seen that motion can create small differences, that gravity can create small differences, and in more extreme conditions, those differences grow. Not enough perhaps to step decades ahead in a single moment, but enough to show that the flow of time is not fixed, it is flexible. And where something is flexible, it invites questions. If time can bend, if it can stretch, if it can move at different rates depending on motion and gravity, then what happens at the edges of those effects? What happens when we consider more extreme possibilities, more unusual conditions? Could time be shaped in ways that go beyond simple stretching? Could it be guided, redirected, perhaps even looped? These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers, but they lead us gently toward the next layer of exploration. Because while motion and gravity show us that time can change, they also reveal something else, a quiet limitation. That altering time, even slightly, requires something immense, energy, not the kind we use in daily life, but something far greater. And as we begin to consider what it would take to shape time more dramatically, we step into a space where possibility and limitation exist side by side. As we've gently discovered, time is not as rigid as it first appears. It stretches when something moves very fast. It slows when gravity becomes stronger. It responds quietly to the deeper structure of the universe. And in those responses, we begin to see something unexpected. Not just that time can change, but that it can be shaped, at least in small ways. And once that idea takes hold, it invites a natural question. If time can stretch and slow, could it be shaped more dramatically? Could it be guided, redirected, perhaps even folded in on itself? This is where the imagination often begins to expand, because in theoretical physics, the careful study of how the universe behaves at its most fundamental level, there are ideas that suggest such possibilities might exist, not as everyday experiences, but as extreme cases, at the edges of what the universe allows. One of the most well-known of these ideas is something often described as a kind of shortcut through space and time. A tunnel, not a physical tunnel made of stone or metal, but a pathway that connects two distant points in a way that bypasses the usual distance between them. If you imagine space as that same soft fabric we described earlier, then a shortcut would not involve travelling across the surface from one point to another. Instead, it would involve bringing those 2 points closer together by bending the fabric itself, like folding a sheet of paper so that 2 distant corners touch, and then passing directly from one to the other. In theory, such a structure could allow for extremely fast travel, not by moving faster through space, but by taking a shorter path. And because space and time are connected, this idea naturally leads to questions about time as well. If you can create a shortcut through space, could you also create a shortcut through time? Could such a pathway allow someone not just to move quickly from one place to another, but from one moment to another? These ideas are often referred to as wormholes, a term that suggests something simple, a passage, a connection. But behind that simplicity lies something far more complex, because while the mathematics that describe these possibilities can exist, turning them into reality is another matter entirely. And this is where we encounter something that cannot be easily avoided, a limitation, not of imagination, but of energy. To understand this, it helps to return to the image of the fabric. If space and time are like a stretched surface, then creating a shortcut, folding it, shaping it, holding it in place, requires force, not a small amount, an enormous amount. Imagine trying to bend an entire ocean, not just a small wave, not just the surface, but the entire body of water, trying to shape it into a specific form and keep it there. The scale of that effort begins to hint at the challenge, because the universe, in its current state, does not easily allow for such dramatic alterations. The kinds of energies involved in bending space and time in extreme ways are far beyond anything we can produce. Even the most powerful events we know, massive stellar explosions, the collapse of enormous stars, operate at levels that are difficult to fully comprehend, and even then, they do not create stable pathways through time. They create change, violent energetic change, but not controlled, precise structures. There is also another layer to this difficulty. Even if such a pathway could be formed, it would need to be stable. It would need to remain open long enough for something to pass through. And according to many theoretical models, such structures would be inherently unstable. They would collapse almost immediately, unless supported by conditions that we have never observed. Conditions involving forms of energy or matter that behave in ways very different from anything we encounter in everyday life. This is sometimes described as requiring negative energy or unusual properties that counteract collapse. But rather than focusing on the technical details, it may be more helpful to think of it this way. Imagine trying to open a tunnel, not through solid ground, but through something that naturally wants to close, something that resists being shaped, something that returns almost instantly to its original form. Keeping such a passage open would require constant effort, constant balance, and at scales that far exceed our current capabilities. So while the idea of travelling through such a structure is fascinating, and while it emerges naturally from the deeper equations that describe space and time, it remains for now beyond reach, not because it has been proven impossible, but because it requires conditions we do not yet know how to create or sustain. And this distinction is important, because it reminds us that there is a difference between what is allowed in theory and what is achievable in practice. The universe may permit certain possibilities, but it does not guarantee that we can access them, at least not easily, and perhaps not at all. So when we return to the idea of time, travel, especially travel into the past, we find ourselves standing at a boundary. On one side, there are the small confirmed effects, time slowing slightly with motion, time shifting slightly with gravity, quiet, measurable changes. On the other side, there are the more dramatic possibilities, shortcuts, loops, pathways that connect distant moments. But between these two sides lies a vast gap, a gap defined not by imagination, but by energy, by scale, by the practical limits of what can be done. And in that gap, something becomes clear, that while time may be flexible, it is not easily controlled. It responds to the structure of the universe, but it does not yield to simple manipulation. It cannot be shaped casually. It cannot be redirected without consequence. And perhaps that is part of what makes it so compelling, because it exists at the edge of understanding, close enough to explore, but distant enough to remain mysterious. And as we move gently beyond these physical limits, another set of ideas begins to emerge. Ideas that do not rely on bending space or generating immense energy, but instead explore what might happen if time itself follows a different kind of path, not forward, not backward, but in circles or as branches, or in ways that allow moments to connect, in unexpected patterns. And as those possibilities begin to unfold, the story of time becomes even more intricate. There is something deeply familiar about moving forward, step by step, moment by moment, one thought leading gently into the next. It is how we experience time every day, a beginning, followed by a middle, followed by an end, a line, simple, continuous, reliable. But what if that line is not the only shape time can take? What if, in some quiet corner of the universe, the path of time bends, just enough to curve back toward itself, not breaking, not reversing suddenly, but slowly, gently, forming a loop? It's a difficult idea to picture at first, because we're so used to thinking of time as something that flows in one direction. Forward, always forward. But if we return for a moment to the image of space and time as something flexible, something that can stretch and bend, then the idea begins to feel just slightly more possible. Imagine walking along a path. At first it feels straight. You move forward, passing familiar markers along the way. Trees, stones, small details that tell you where you are. But as you continue, something subtle begins to change. The path curves, not sharply, not enough to notice immediately, just enough that over time it begins to circle, and eventually vastas. Without realizing it, you find yourself approaching a place you've seen before, not by turning around, but by continuing forward. This is the essence of what some theories suggest, that under very specific conditions, time might allow for a path that circles back, a journey where moving forward eventually leads to an earlier point, not by reversing direction, but by following the natural curve of the path. It's sometimes described in more formal language as a kind of loop in time, but rather than focusing on the terminology, it may be more helpful to hold on to the image, a path that returns, quietly, to where it once was. And as soon as we imagine such a path, another thought arises, a quiet question. If you could follow that path, what would happen? What would it mean to arrive at a moment that has already taken place, to stand once again within an earlier time? This is where the idea becomes more delicate, because it introduces something that feels uncertain, a kind of puzzle, not loud or dramatic, but persistent. If you were to return to a moment in the past, could you change it? Could you act differently? Could you alter something that has already happened? And if you could, what would that mean for everything that followed? These questions are often explored through simple examples, not because they are easy to answer, but because they make the idea easier to feel. Imagine meeting someone important in your past, a moment that shaped your life in some way. Now imagine returning to that moment with everything you know now. Would you speak differently? Would you choose another path? And if you did, would your present still unfold in the same way? It's a quiet puzzle, one that doesn't quite settle, because each answer seems to lead to another question. If the past can be changed, then what happens to the present that came from it? And if the present changes, what happens to the version of you that decided to go back? The mind begins to circle, much like the loop itself, and yet some ideas offer a gentler way of thinking about this. Instead of imagining that time can be freely changed, they suggest something more subtle, that even within a loop, events may remain consistent, not forced, not rigid, but quietly aligned. In this view, if such a loop existed, anything that happens within it would already be part of the timeline. Nothing would truly break. Nothing would create a contradiction, because every action, every choice, would already be woven into the fabric of events. It's a bit like reading a story. At first, the events unfold one by one. You don't know what will happen next. But if you return to an earlier chapter, you don't change the outcome. You see it differently. You notice details you missed before, but the story remains the same. In a similar way, a loop in time might not allow for change, but for perspective, for revisiting, rather than rewriting. This idea does not solve the puzzle completely, but it softens it. It shifts the question from "can the past be changed?" to something quieter. What if it was always this way? And in that shift, the tension begins to ease, because the loop is no longer a break in reality, it becomes part of it. Natural shape within the larger structure of time, still unusual, still difficult to imagine, but not entirely impossible, at least not in theory. Of course, as we've seen before, theory and reality are not always the same. Even if such paths could exist, creating or accessing them would require conditions far beyond anything we currently understand or can achieve. And so, for now, these loops remain ideas, carefully explored, gently considered, but not directly observed. And yet, even as ideas, they have a certain quiet beauty, because they invite us to see time differently, not as a straight line we are carried along, but as something more intricate, something that can curve, something that can return, something that may hold more structure than we can easily perceive. And as we sit with that possibility, without needing to resolve it, another thought begins to emerge. If time can form loops, perhaps it can also branch, not returning to the same point but unfolding into many paths at once. And in those paths, perhaps every possibility finds its place. There is a quiet way to ease a difficult question, not by forcing an answer, but by changing the way the question is asked. When we considered the idea of time looping back on itself, we encountered something that didn't quite settle. A gentle tension, a puzzle that seemed to circle without fully resolving. What happens if the past and present meet? Can something be changed without unraveling everything that follows? But there is another way to approach this, one that does not require the past to be rewritten or protected or carefully preserved. Instead, it allows for something else, a kind of unfolding. Imagine for a moment a single path. You're walking along it step by step, moving forward. The path stretches ahead, and behind you it fades into memory. It feels continuous, singular, the only path there is. But now, imagine that at certain points along the way, the path divides, not dramatically, not with a sudden break, but gently, like a tree growing new branches. At each division, there are now two paths instead of one, and each path continues forward, independently. If you were standing at that point, you might only choose one direction. You would follow a single branch, moving forward, unaware of the other. But the other path still exists. It does not disappear. It simply unfolds separately. This is one way to imagine a different structure of reality, not as a single fixed timeline, but as a collection of many possible paths, each one consistent, each one complete, but not all experienced at once. In this view, events do not overwrite one another. They diverge, a choice is made, and rather than eliminating all other possibilities, it allows those possibilities to continue along different paths, quietly, without interfering. And when we return to the idea of time travelers, especially those who claim knowledge of events that do not unfold as expected, this perspective offers a different kind of interpretation. Perhaps the predictions were not wrong. Perhaps they belonged to a different path, a version of events that did unfold, just not along the branch we experience. It is a subtle shift, but it changes everything, because it removes the need for contradiction. There is no need to explain why a prediction failed. It did not fail. It simply does not apply here. This idea was often used to explain stories where individuals described futures that never came to pass. Rather than dismissing those accounts entirely, Some interpretations suggest that those descriptions may correspond to alternate developments, paths that diverge from our own at some earlier point. Of course, this does not confirm that such paths exist. It simply provides a framework, a way of thinking that allows multiple outcomes without conflict. And once again, it is not necessary to focus on technical language. The image itself is enough. A tree, branches extending outward, each one growing in its own direction, none cancelling the others, all existing together. In this way, reality becomes less like a single road and more like a landscape of possibilities, and we, as observers, experience just one path at a time. Now, there is something both comforting and unsettling about this idea. Comforting, because it allows for every possibility to exist somewhere, every outcome, every choice, every version of events, but also unsettling, because it suggests that the version we experience is not the only one. It is simply the one we are part of. And so, when someone describes a future that feels unfamiliar, or a world that does not match our own, it may not require that they travelled through time in the way we usually imagine. Instead, it may suggest something quieter, that they are describing a path that is not ours, not wrong, just different. Of course, this raises its own questions. If multiple paths exist, can they ever interact? Can information move between them? Can awareness shift from one to another? These are deeper questions, and they do not yet have clear answers, but they lead us gently towards something even more subtle. Because while branching paths suggest separation, there are also stories that suggest something else entirely. Not separation, but overlap. Moments where two paths seem to touch, briefly, before continuing on their own. Moments where something from one time appears within another, not fully, not permanently, but just long enough to be noticed. And when that happens, it does not feel like travel. It feels like a crossing, a quiet intersection between moments that are usually kept apart. And as we begin to explore those intersections, those brief dreamlike experiences where time seems to blur, we step into one of the most delicate ideas of all. That time, instead of moving cleanly from one moment to the next, might occasionally allow two moments to exist, side by side, even if only for an instant. There are some experiences that do not feel like journeys. No clear beginning, no defined movement, no sense of travelling from one place to another, and yet something is different. Not dramatically, not in a way that disrupts everything, but just enough to create a quiet feeling that the moment you're in does not fully belong to itself. These are sometimes described as time slips, not as a deliberate act, not as a controlled event, but as something that happens gently, unexpectedly, and often very briefly. A moment where time seems to overlap, where 2 points, normally separated, appear to exist side by side. One of the most well-known examples comes from a quiet place, far removed from laboratories or experiments, a garden, calm, ordered, familiar. Two individuals walking through the grounds describe something unusual. At first, everything feels normal, the paths are clear, the air is still, the surroundings are as expected. But then, something shifts. The atmosphere becomes heavier, not in a physical sense, but in a way that is difficult to describe. The colours seem slightly muted, the air feels still, almost suspended, and as they continue walking, they begin to notice figures, people dressed in clothing that does not belong to the present, not costumes, not something theatrical, but natural, as though they are simply part of another time. The figures move quietly, they do not interact. They seem unaware of being observed, and for a brief moment, both scenes exist together, the present and something older, layered, overlapping. Then, just as gently as it began, it fades. The atmosphere returns to normal. The figures are gone. The garden is once again exactly as it should be. There is no clear boundary, no moment where one world ends and the other begins. Only a transition, so subtle that it almost feels like a shift in perception. And yet, for those who experienced it, the memory remains clear, not fragmented, not uncertain, but vivid, as though they briefly stepped into something that was already there, but usually unseen. There are other accounts, different in detail, but similar in feeling. A pilot flying over a familiar landscape, noticing something unusual below, a structure, a runway, a pattern that does not match the present environment. It appears clearly, not imagined, not distant, and then, later, when returning to the same location, nothing is there, only open land, no trace of what was seen before. In these cases, the experience does not feel like travelling. There is no sense of movement through time. Instead, it feels as though time itself has shifted, just slightly, allowing another moment to become visible, like two images briefly aligning, or two layers becoming transparent enough to see through, and then separating again. Of course, there are explanations, there are always explanations. Perception can be influenced by expectation. Memory can shape itself after the fact. The mind can fill in details, creating a sense of coherence where there was uncertainty. Environmental factors, light, atmosphere, fatigue, can alter how we interpret what we see. And these explanations are important. They help ground us. They remind us that extraordinary experiences do not always require extraordinary causes. But even with those explanations in place, something about these accounts remains, not because they prove anything, but because they feel consistent, not in detail, but in tone, a quiet shift, a sense of disconnection, a moment that feels slightly out of place, as though it belongs somewhere else. And perhaps that is the most interesting part, because these experiences do not describe time as something that can be controlled or navigated. They describe it as something that, occasionally, behaves differently, not predictably, not repeatedly, but rarely and briefly, and always without warning. It's a bit like watching reflections on water. Most of the time, the surface is stable, clear enough to show what is above it. But when the water shifts, when the angle changes, or the light bends just slightly, you might see something unexpected, an image that does not match what you expect, a reflection that seems to come from somewhere else, and then, just as quickly, it disappears, leaving only the surface behind. In that sense, time slips are not about travelling through time. They are about glimpsing it from a different angle, a brief crossing of paths, not enough to step into another moment fully, but enough to notice that another moment might be there, somewhere. And as we sit with that idea, gently, without needing to define it too clearly, it begins to connect with everything we've explored so far. The stories of individuals who appear and vanish, the mind's ability to shape memory and perception, the physical reality that allows time to stretch and bend, the theoretical possibilities of loops and branches, each one offering a different perspective, a different way of understanding time, and perhaps none of them, on their own, provide a complete answer. But together, they form something else, a landscape, a collection of ideas that, when placed side by side, suggest that time is not as simple as it first appears, not rigid, not entirely fixed, but layered, subtle, and occasionally just slightly out of alignment. And as that thought settles, quietly, it brings us toward the final part of our journey. Not to resolve the mystery, but to reflect on it, to gather the threads we've followed and see what remains when we hold them together. There's a quiet moment that comes at the end of any long journey, not a sudden stop, not a sharp conclusion, but a gradual slowing where the details begin to settle and what remains is not just information, but a feeling. And as we reach that point here, it becomes possible to look back, not to solve everything we've seen, but to notice what has stayed with us. The stories. They were where we began. Individuals appearing in places where they didn't seem to belong. People carrying objects that felt out of time, accounts that started quietly and ended without resolution. They didn't arrive with clear explanations. They did not offer proof that could be easily confirmed, but they lingered, not because they demanded belief, but because they invited curiosity. And as we followed those stories gently, we began to notice patterns, appearance, disorientation, and often disappearance. Not dramatic endings, but absences. Moments where something simply slipped away. And that absence left space for questions, but also space for interpretation. Because as we moved deeper, another layer revealed itself, not in the world around us, but within the mind. We began to see how memory is not fixed, but reconstructed, how experiences can feel real, even when they are shaped by perception, by influence, by the quiet blending of imagination and recall. We saw how time itself, as it is experienced internally, can stretch, compress, and shift. Moments that feel longer than they are, hours that seem to disappear, sequences that blur, repeat, or echo. And in that understanding, something changed. The stories of time travel no longer needed to rely entirely on external events. They could emerge from within, from the way the mind interprets time, from the way it builds continuity, even when the underlying experience is uncertain. And yet, even that was not the end of the journey, because beyond perception there is the structure of the universe itself, and there something equally unexpected appears. That time, even in its physical form, is not absolute. It responds to motion, to gravity. It stretches gently as speed increases. It slows quietly in the presence of mass, not in ways we notice day to day, but in ways that can be measured, confirmed, understood. And this realization adds another layer, because it shows that time is not just a backdrop. It is part of the system, part of the structure, something that can bend within certain limits. And at those limits, imagination begins to extend outward, carefully, tentatively, exploring possibilities that remain untested but not entirely excluded, paths that might loop back, moments that might branch into multiple outcomes, experiences where different times seem to overlap just briefly before separating again. Each of these ideas offers a different way of thinking, not as definitive answers, but as perspectives, ways of approaching something that does not fit easily into a single explanation. And when placed together, they form something that feels complete in a different sense, not because everything has been resolved, but because the mystery has been explored from many angles, gently, without forcing a conclusion. Because perhaps the most important thing we have seen is this, that uncertainty does not always need to be removed. It can be held, observed, allowed to exist without immediate resolution. The stories remain, the questions remain, and so does the quiet space between them, a space where imagination and understanding meet, where science and experience overlap, where something can feel meaningful, even if it is not fully explained. And in that space, something else begins to emerge, Not an answer, but a reflection. Because as we consider all of this, time as we measure it, time as we feel it, time as we imagine it, we begin to see that the question is not only about whether time travel is possible, it is also about how we relate to time itself, how we move through it, how we remember it, how we anticipate what comes next. Because time is not just something that happens around us, it is something we live within, constantly, and perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate. Not because they prove anything, but because they touch something familiar. This sense that time is both close and distant, understood and mysterious, structured and fluid. And as we sit with that feeling without needing to resolve it, we arrive at a quiet understanding that the mystery remains, not because we lack answers, but because we continue to ask questions, and in that asking, we remain connected to something larger, something that extends beyond any single explanation, something that invites us to keep exploring, gently and without urgency. And as that thought settles softly, there is one final step to take, not forward and not backward, but inward, toward a simple question, one that does not require science or evidence or certainty, only imagination. There is a certain kind of question that does not need a precise answer, a question that exists not to be solved, but to be experienced. And after everything we've explored, the stories, the patterns, the mind, the science, the quiet possibilities, it feels natural to arrive here, not at a conclusion, but at a moment of reflection. If time were just a little softer than it seems, if it could bend just enough to allow a step beyond the present, where might your thoughts drift? Not in a rushed way, not as a decision, but gently, like watching your mind wander at the edge of sleep. Perhaps it moves toward the past, not a distant historical past, but something closer, a familiar place, a quiet room, a moment that lingers in memory. You might not want to change it, not necessarily, but simply to be there again, to notice the details more clearly, the way the light fell across a surface, the sound of someone's voice, the feeling of being present without knowing what comes next. There is something comforting in that idea, not because it alters anything, but because it allows us to revisit something meaningful, and then, just as gently, your thoughts might move in another direction, toward the future, not a fixed destination, but a space of possibility, unformed, open. You might imagine a place you've never seen, a version of your life that has not yet unfolded, not in sharp detail, but in soft outlines, a sense of what could be. And in that space there is a different kind of feeling, not memory, but anticipation, not certainty, but curiosity. Because the future, unlike the past, does not yet carry the weight of experience. It is still being shaped, still unfolding, moment by moment. And perhaps that is what makes it feel both distant and close at the same time. We are always moving toward it, and yet we never quite arrive ahead of ourselves. And somewhere between these two directions, the past we remember and the future we imagine, we find the present, this quiet, passing moment, often unnoticed, often taken for granted, and yet it is the only place where experience actually happens, where time is not something we recall or anticipate, but something we live, right now. And there is something quietly remarkable about that, because even though we cannot step outside of time, we're constantly moving through it, each second arriving and then gently becoming memory, each moment forming part of a larger story. A story that does not need to be fully understood to be meaningful, and perhaps that is where all of this leads. Not to the ability to travel through time, but to a different way of noticing it, a softer awareness. That time is not just something that passes, but something that holds moments, experiences, connections, and even the questions we've explored tonight. Because those questions too become part of the story. They remain, not as problems to solve, but as quiet companions. And if you feel like sharing, you can always leave a small note below where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. It's always a gentle reminder that while we each experience time in our own way, we are all moving through it together, each in our own place, each in our own moment. And as this journey comes to a close, there is no need for a final answer. No need to decide what is true or what is not. The stories can remain as they are. The ideas can settle where they feel most comfortable, and the mystery can simply continue, softly, unresolved, like a thought that fades, not because it has been completed, but because it no longer needs to be held. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's exploration. Whether your eyes are still open, or you're already drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming, thank you for being here. If you'd like to return for more quiet journeys like this, you're always welcome. And if this moment brought even a small sense of calm, then it has already done what it needed to do. Time has a way of moving forward, whether we notice it or not. But here, in this quiet space, it slows just enough to let you rest. Sleep peacefully, wherever and whenever you may be.